see more people. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Geneviève Zabriskie, and I'm director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia and the Center for European Studies. And today I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker, David Petruccelli, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. He joined that institution after completing his PhD at Yale under the supervision of Tim Snyder. For his dissertation, David consulted archives in 8 different countries, immersing himself in dusty paper trails written in Polish, German, French, English, and even a Hungarian, although he told me modestly that he didn't have help for the Hungarian archive section. He's now working on a book manuscript that is bound to make a splash when it's published, given the topic, international crime, but also given the careful work that he's completed in these as of yet unexamined archival sources that he's using to make sense of a very complex transnational processes involving a multitude of agents, institutions, and ordinary citizens. So when he's talking about transnational crime organization, it is truly transnational, and the work he had to do brought him to different countries across Europe, from Poland to London, right? His book manuscript is entitled A Scourge of Humanity, International Crime, Law, and Policing in Interwar Period. And it's the book that tells that story. But if you cannot wait to actually read the book, pieces have been published in the Journal of Contemporary History and Contemporary European History. And of course today, he'll tell us about the Austrian connection, internationalism, empire, and the interwar origins on the war on drugs. Before we welcome him, I would like everyone to turn off their cell phones. And with that done, please, David, the stage is yours.
Okay. Great, thank you. I want to thank Geneviève and Zana for organizing my visit here. And I'm very excited to speak to you all today. And of course, I want to thank you all for coming out to listen to my talk. So, in May 1938, a man of around 50 years of age checked himself into the Burg-Hölzli clinic outside of Zurich in Switzerland. You can see that pictured here. Carlos Fernandez Bacula told the examining physicians at the clinic an amazing tale. He said that he was a Peruvian diplomat who had been falsely accused of being a drug trafficker. The Vienna police had hounded him out of his job a decade earlier, and since then American and European police agents had followed him from country to country. He said they opened his mail, they listened in on his telephone calls, and they pursued him whenever he left his house. The physicians at the clinic decided to hold Bacula to assess the depths of his persecution fantasies. But a month later, the Swiss government informed the clinic that his extradition had been requested by 2 different countries. The mystery in this story is not whether Bacula was guilty. As we'll see today, the evidence against him was fairly damning. Nor is the question how he came to be the subject of this international police apparatus that was meant to track down and stop the flow of narcotics. His account of that was actually fairly accurate. Rather, the question is how this kind of an apparatus could emerge so quickly and with such far reach in a very short manner of time. When Bacula was born in Lima, Peru, in 1888, the world looked very different. Back then, narcotics such as cocaine, morphine, and heroin were lightly regulated consumer goods in most of the world. So if your child had a toothache, you might buy a cocaine lozenge to suck on. Or if you had a cough, you might take heroin for that. At that point, Bacula's country, Peru, was at the center of a thriving global industry in cocaine that was going to all corners of the world. By the time Bacula checked himself into the Burg-Hölzli clinic, things looked very different. A vast control system had emerged that was meant to limit the use of these drugs to what were deemed legitimate medical and scientific purposes. At this point, depictions in the press of drug use would not be advertisements like these, but would be tales of criminality and exploitation, like this news story about Bacula's detention in Switzerland, dubbing him the dope-bring diplomat. Scholars who have tried to explain this transformation, the emergence of this drug control regime, have long had a principal culprit in mind, the United States. And there's good reason for this. From the 1890s until today, the United States has been one of the major motors behind drug controls. But if you look at the critical interwar decades when this system emerged, and especially at the 1920s, when the legal edifice of drug controls were first established, the United States was largely absent from discussions. It is now clear that the League of Nations played a very important role in forging the global drug control regime. Understanding this contributes to a broader scholarly reassessment that is now underway of the League of Nations. It was long dismissed for its failures to provide collective security in Europe. And this is a story most of us are probably familiar with. But in the past 2 decades, scholars have begun to look at its work in other fields, from public health to the administration of refugees, the protection of minorities, or the control of narcotics, which is what I'll talk about today. So we now have a new picture emerging of the League of Nations, which shows that it was both much more influential than we previously thought, and also more rooted in sheer power politics. Key to this reinterpretation of the League has been an analysis of the role of imperialism in the League's functioning. Scholars have shown how Western Europeans, especially French and British officials, looked to the League of Nations as a way to respond to the challenges that the First World War had posed for the imperial project overseas. Internationalism through the League could be a way for these officials to try to reform empire and in that way save it at a time when it was facing mounting challenges both at home and abroad. In today's talk, I want to use the story of Carlos Bakula to broaden our picture of this imperial crisis, to look not only at the internationalist visions that were emerging from overseas colonialism, but also the way that the collapse of empire within Europe led people to think in new ways about how to organize the international system. So Bakula's family had roots in Croatia, and they had ties to the large Croat community in Huánuco, Peru, which was the center of Peru's pre-war global cocaine industry. There's no evidence that him or his family were involved in the trade, but they clearly prospered from the wealth that it brought to the region. At the age of 13, his parents sent him to Germany to study engineering, and he stayed in the country after he graduated until the outbreak of the First World War, when he moved to Switzerland. In Switzerland, he fell in with a card sharp and con artist by the name of Louis Lyon. I don't believe that was his real name. And they traveled the country grifting and cheating people at cards and building up a sizable criminal record. This record did not impede Bakula's career in the diplomatic service after the war, when he took a job at the Peruvian consulate in Geneva. At this point, Geneva was emerging as a center of international efforts to control the global narcotics trade. These control efforts had their roots in the pre-war crusade against opium. European expansion into East Asia had been fueled by the sale of opium there. We could think of, especially in China, with the Opium Wars. This is a political cartoon from the 19th century depicting the way that Europeans were feeding opium to China in order to crack open the markets. By the end of the 19th century, a global anti-opium movement had emerged. We can think of this as sort of an early global civil society groups coming together to decry the trade in opium by Western Europeans. And they were calling for bringing opium trade under control. In 1911, Washington called a conference in The Hague to discuss the problem. The resulting Hague Opium Convention of 1912 transformed this East Asian opium problem into the global narcotics problem as we understand it today. The convention committed its adherents not only to control the trade in raw opium in Asia, but also manufactured narcotics, morphine, heroin, and cocaine. This was partly from fear of addiction. If you're giving cocaine cough drops and heroin to children and other people for sicknesses, people are going to get addicted. And there was an increasing awareness of this potential in the drugs. But it was mostly from geopolitical considerations. Great Britain wanted to distract attention from its own history trading opium in East Asia, and it wanted to attack the global dominance of German pharmaceutical firms, which then had a near monopoly on cocaine and a plurality of morphine sales globally. Berlin countered by insisting that 34 states would have to ratify the 1912 convention before it went into effect. And this was a way for them to try to block its actual implementation. But after the First World War, the Allies simply wrote an obligation to ratify this convention into the Versailles Treaty and the other treaties that ended the war. And they gave oversight over this to the League of Nations, which was born at that point. The League set up a body known as the Opium Advisory Committee. You see pictured here in 1938, which would advise on narcotics policy that would be pursued from Geneva. The advisory committee was made up of delegates of countries with significant opium and pharmaceutical interests. And recognizing that they needed the participation of non-members of the League, they added Germany and the United States early in the 1920s. The committee became the major site for formulating global narcotics policy between the two world wars. So the League of Nations is famous, I think, to most of us as a project of the United States President Woodrow Wilson. But it was really Britain that set its agenda in Geneva, especially in its first decade after the US failed to join. Historians have described the program that the British pursued there as imperial internationalist. So they drew inspiration from the British Empire for how to organize international governance. But they also wanted to use these international institutions that they were developing in order to reform empire at a time when it was being criticized. Drugs encapsulated this imperial internationalist approach. The British representative in Geneva on drug matters was a Home Office bureaucrat named Malcolm Delavine. I think he very much looks the part of a mid-level bureaucrat. He was a true believer in drug control, so he wanted to both control agricultural production and the smoking of raw opium, as well as control the production and distribution of refined narcotics, so heroin, morphine, cocaine. But he was blocked in the first regard by imperial interests in London. At this point, the British Empire continued to rely heavily on the sale of opium to finance its administration in East Asia, and they had no interest in bringing opium for smoking under control. So he focused in Geneva on controlling pharmaceutical production and distribution. This was a concession to imperial interests, but Delavine also hoped that by changing the global norms and the global conversation about drugs, he would lead eventually to a reform of imperial practice in East Asia. The major manufacturing powers at the time, especially Germany and Switzerland, were opposed to bringing pharmaceuticals under control. They had a large share of the global markets in cocaine and morphine, and they had no interest in seeing this throttled by the British. So in order to overcome the resistance from these countries, Delavine published a series of cases where European pharmaceuticals were intercepted on the way to East Asia. And he brought this to the attention through the League of Nations to the attention of the world. And then he used the public outcry that this generated in order to spearhead the drafting of a new international convention that he hoped would finally bring pharmaceuticals under control. The 1925 Hague Opium Convention set up a system of export and import certificates. So it was meant to track the flows of drugs in order to see that nobody was producing more drugs than were needed by the world. It also introduced a whole new international body in Geneva that would tabulate the statistics. But it had very weak enforcement mechanisms. So its major achievement was not to stop the flows of narcotics, but to show the scale of the problem. You can see here the data that the League of Nations collected between 1925 and 1930. I think there are two important points from this graph, from the two graphs on morphine and heroin. The first is, as you can see, the production of both drugs increased after the completion of this convention in 1925. The pharmaceuticals ratcheted up their production for sale. The second thing, on the far right, you could see the black line is global demand that the League of Nations estimated. So this would have been the demand for medical and scientific purposes for these substances. So you can see every year production of both drugs vastly outstripped what was needed by the world for what were considered legitimate purposes. So where were these drugs going? The League of Nations concluded, probably correctly, that the drugs were being moved from these pharmaceuticals into the illicit market. And what had happened was large trafficking organizations emerged that would buy up pharmaceutical drugs from the producers in the countries that you can see, from Germany, from France, from Japan, from Switzerland, which were the major producers at this point. And then they would move these to the black markets in the United States, in China, and increasingly in Egypt, which were the major consumer markets at this point. They would use different ways to get the drugs there. So some would simply route the drugs through countries with weak regulations. So as different states would impose new drug regulations, there would always be a weak link in the chain. For a while, this was Netherlands. At another point, it would be a state like Belgium, and this would be an easy way to move the drugs into the black market. Other traffickers took a more direct route. They might simply hide the drugs inside of luggage that they brought overseas. This is a picture of a large piece of luggage that was intercepted in Egypt in 1929 with several kilos of heroin hidden inside of it. This was a method that Carlos Fernandez Bacula adopted, but he offered a clever variation on this. Because he was a diplomat, he could carry it in his luggage without fear of being searched. And so he moved several hundred, maybe thousands of kilos of heroin from Central Europe to different countries in this period. He was probably brought into the trade by a man named Joseph Raskin, who was a Jew from the Russian Empire who moved to France after the Russian Revolution in 1917, and he became a major stakeholder in a narcotics factory in Mulhouse, France, on the border with Switzerland and Germany. This became famous as one of the major producers for the illicit market in the second half of the 1920s. And Bacula carried much of the drugs for Raskin that was coming out of this factory. So faced with this burgeoning illicit traffic, Malcolm Delavigne, the British official, grew determined to produce yet another international convention that would finally bring pharmaceutical production under control. And after protracted efforts, he secured the passing of this convention in 1931. The 1931 Limitation Convention did finally create effective controls on the manufacture and distribution of pharmaceutical narcotics. It tied the amount of production factories or the amount of drugs factories would produce to the global estimates that each country would have for how much they would need each year. What it did not do was end the illicit trade in drugs. Delavigne's control system was premised on the idea that the core problem of the illicit drug trade, the core cause, was excess production by pharmaceuticals. So he thought that if we can control pharmaceuticals, there will no longer be too many drugs and people won't use them anymore. This was not right. What happened after 1931 is trafficking groups figured out ways that they could produce their own drugs, so they no longer needed to go to pharmaceutical firms to get cocaine or heroin. They could open their own factories for production. So by showing the limits of a model focusing entirely on economic regulation, the growth of this illicit traffic also augured the end of British leadership on the question of drugs in the 1930s. So in this decade, League officials looked around for new solutions to the problem of narcotics, and the Vienna police offered an alternative model. In the second half of the 1920s, Vienna had emerged as one of the major global centers of the illicit drug trade. This was both because of its central location close to production sites in Germany, Switzerland, France, and also because it had very weak drug laws. At this point, you faced, for trafficking even hundreds of kilos of heroin, you might face 8 weeks in prison as a sentence, and you couldn't be extradited for it. So as a result of this, traffickers converged on Vienna. It became known in international circles as the El Dorado of drug traffickers. Carlos Fernandez Bacula was one of the traffickers who settled in Vienna. He served first in the Peruvian consulate and then in the embassy in the city between 1924 and 1930. He bought a small palace in the city with his illicit earnings. You see pictures here he submitted with one of his appeals against his extradition request. He hosted lavish parties in this palace, both for diplomats and for several high-ranking traffickers in the city. And he smuggled thousands of kilograms of heroin for various trafficking groups that were based there. Vienna's notoriety represented an opportunity for the police president in the city, a man named Johann Schober. You see him here. Schober was not only the top police official in Austria, but also one of the country's most important political leaders in the 1920s. He served twice as chancellor in 1921 to 1922 and 1929 to 1930. And he also had several stints as foreign minister and as vice chancellor. Schober's Austria was a country that faced an existential crisis. The dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the First World War had set off a scramble for its lands among its several successor states. You can see pictured here. Shorn of its imperial hinterlands, the Austrian Republic declared itself a part of the German Empire, but the Allies forbade a union of the two states. Many Austrians throughout the interwar period felt that this small, independent Austria was actually incapable of existence as a state, and they looked for a union with some sort of larger confederation, probably with Germany. Johann Schober shared the gloom of his countrymen. He was a monarchist and he mourned the passing of the Habsburg Empire. And he was also a pan-Germanist, and he thought the future of his country lay in some sort of union with its northern neighbor. But he was also a pragmatist. He accepted the fact that the post-war status quo was going to be perpetuated for some time. In his political career, he focused on forging economic and administrative ties with neighbors of Austria in order to secure the country's continued existence and possibly its prosperity. International policing represented another route towards regional integration for Schober. In 1923, he called an International Police Congress in Vienna. He had hoped that this would interest the former Habsburg and German police officials in restoring pre-war ties that had been shorn with the war and the revolutions afterwards. But the conference ended up exceeding his ambitions. It brought together officials from across Europe and some officials from outside Europe. And it led to the founding of a permanent institution known as the International Criminal Police Commission, which had its headquarters in Vienna after it was founded in 1923. Viewed narrowly, the commission was sort of a club of police officers from Europe and from some other states that would meet every couple of years to discuss new techniques and to trade ideas about how policing should be organized. But the Austrians also hoped to build some sort of international institution out of this. And they set up a bureau in Vienna that would form a nucleus for this. Schober left the details of this work to one of his deputies named Bruno Schulz, as he pictured here. Schulz envisioned the construction of a vast network of national police offices that would centralize policing in each state and would communicate between each other and with this international bureau that he ran in Vienna. This model sought to strengthen national law enforcement capacities, so within each state, by safeguarding the sovereignty of these states. And through this would facilitate cross-border cooperation and greater international cooperation. So the idea was that this was sort of internationalism through the consolidation of national policing. So this was a product of the transformation of East Central Europe from several large land empires into a world of many smaller nation states that were interested in developing their capacities in various fields, including policing. It also, I think, targeted international criminals who represented this transition from empires to nation states. The groups that it targeted, such as Roma and Jews, represented groups that did not fit into the new world of nation states in the region. Nowhere was this more clear than in the drug trade. Throughout the interwar period, Jews of Eastern European origin were at the top of the international drug trade. Obviously, official anti-Semitism overstated their role here, but there were also various historical reasons for their involvement in trafficking drugs. Jews in Eastern Europe were traditionally involved in selling alcohol in the Russian Empire in particular, in smuggling goods across imperial borders, and they had broad diaspora connections that were very useful for a trade that relied on personal ties and secrecy. The other major group that was overrepresented in the drug trade in this period, the Greeks, were overrepresented for similar reasons as sort of a post-imperial people. This demographic character allowed Schulz to argue that this was not just a regional problem, but also a global one. As he told the Opium Advisory Committee in Geneva in 1931, quote, "In truth, this is a question of cosmopolitan criminals who know neither nationality nor morality, spread, unfortunately, to the entire civilized world, a scourge of all humanity." So he spoke these words as the new Austrian representative to the Opium Advisory Committee in Geneva. Earlier that year, the committee had asked the country to appoint a delegate because of its important position in the illicit traffic. And then Chancellor Schober appointed Schulz to represent both his country and the interests of international policing in Geneva. Since the founding of the International Criminal Police Commission in 1923, Schober had sought in various ways to push for cooperation between the League of Nations and his institution, but with very limited success. By the 1930s, drugs represented an area where they could pursue this kind of cooperation, and by doing so, opened the door for other fields of cooperation. The British model of economic regulation of drugs was faltering at this point, and the officials in Geneva were looking for other models for how they could fight the drug trade. And the Vienna police offered one based on how they fought international criminality and international crime. In Geneva, Bruno Schulz pushed for improving the policing of narcotics along the lines advocated by the Commission. So he pushed for centralizing the police apparatuses in each state and for their exchange, preferably through the International Bureau in Vienna. His work eventually led to the third major international convention on narcotics, which anchored most of these aspects of the Commission's program in international law. So this 1936 anti-trafficking convention marked a very important shift in the way the world dealt with the problem of drugs. As we've seen, the earlier conventions were targeting what we could think of as illicit activity. So pharmaceutical production that was legal and how these drugs were being moved into black markets. Now the world was increasingly thinking of drugs as an illicit activity. So they were targeting drug traffickers, and the focus would now be on the distributors of drugs, on illicit production and on illicit distribution and increasingly also use. Schultz's International Bureau also set about improving the practical police cooperation against the drug trade in the 1930s. By 1932, most of the dozen or so traffickers who had been based in Vienna had been expelled by the police, and they took up in other countries. And the Vienna police tracked them as they moved around the region. In 1930, several chemists had turned up in Turkey, which became a base of several secret heroin factories. When the Turkish government intervened a few years later, the traffickers moved to Bulgaria. In 1932, Joseph Raskin, the Russian Jew who had brought Bakula into the traffic, and several other Vienna traffickers opened an illicit heroin factory in the town of Radomir in Bulgaria. You can see here a picture from inside of the heroin factory. In its first 2 months in operations alone, it produced 1,500 kilograms of heroin for sale on the black market. When the Bulgarian authorities shut down these factories in 1934 in the face of mounting international pressure, the production simply moved across the border to Yugoslavia. Other traffickers took up in Prague, which they used as a base for operations, which, like Vienna before it, had weak drug laws and inexperienced police. So throughout this period, the International Criminal Police Commission played a critical role tracking these traffickers as they moved across this region of Eastern and Central Europe, facilitating the exchanges between the police and providing models for the professionalization of narcotics policing. One of the most elusive traffickers being pursued from Vienna was our friend Carlos Fernandez Bakula. The Vienna police had learned of his activities from a statement from Joseph Raskin when they arrested him in 1930, and then they pressed the Peruvian government to remove him from his post. In May 1931, Bruno Schultz distributed a police circular to all of the members of the International Criminal Police Commission, to other police forces, and to the League of Nations, detailing Bakula's activities as a drug trafficker. At this point, Carlos Bakula was in Paris, where he met up with his old friend Louis Léon. Louis Léon was, by this point, probably the major fixer for all important drug deals moving through Paris. And Bakula helped him with this task. So Bakula knew he was being watched, so he took a step back from directly carrying drugs in his suitcase. Now he managed a group of other Latin American diplomats he had recruited to carry drugs for him. He and Léon also went in on financing a secret heroin factory in the suburb of Paris, which the police discovered after a chemical explosion in 1935. You see here pictures from police photographs from inside the factory. The top left are some of the equipment, on the right are several trays of heroin. So the Paris police were not able to link either Léon or Bakula to the lab, but Bakula decided it was probably best to leave town. He went back to Vienna, where the Vienna police once more put him under surveillance. But they weren't able to find evidence at this point. They searched his house, his palace, but there were no drugs there. In 1937, though, the Vienna police seized a shipment of opium, raw opium, coming from Yugoslavia to Paris. And they found evidence on board the train that it was hidden in that Bakula had organized the shipment. So Bakula fled once more, now to Switzerland. In order to finally catch him, the Vienna police would need the assistance of another police force, the Americans. So as we've seen, the United States has set the global agenda before the First World War. It was the US initiative that led to this 1912 Hague Opium Convention. For the Americans at this point, this was part of a broader moral crusade against European colonialism in East Asia. They decried the sale of opium by the European imperial powers as a way of trying to open up East Asian markets for Americans. There was, of course, a good deal of hypocrisy to this. the Americans were developing much of their own domestic drug policy in Philippines, which they had recently acquired from Spain. But there was also a real anti-colonial impulse behind the anti-opium agitation. In the 1920s, though, the United States relinquished leadership to Britain, as we've seen. It did not join the League of Nations, and it was relatively uninvolved in international talks on drugs. This would only change after 1930, when a man named Harry J. Anslinger took over the newly established Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was meant to centralize authority over drug questions. During his time in office, 32 years until well after the Second World War, Anslinger consolidated all aspects of American drug policy in his hands and in his office and personally. At home, he launched a crusade against the dope fiends and the drug dealers that he claimed infested all of America's cities. But he also tried to engage more with the world to stop drugs from flowing into the United States from abroad. Beginning in 1931, he played a leading role in discussions at the League of Nations of how to deal with the drug problem. And he built a secretive network of agents spread across Europe and parts of East Asia that he would use to find the to uncover trafficking organizations and to intercept shipments of drugs that were destined for the US. So his model of international policing was very different than the vision that had been developed in Vienna. Unlike Johann Schoebe and Bruno Schulz, Anslinger had very little regard for the professionalism of other police forces. And rather than multilateral norms and international conventions, as they pursued, he built a system of bilateral agreements that would centralize all authority in Washington and in his office. This system worked because Anslinger made very smart use of his advantages. The European police forces might resent it when they discovered that American agents had been operating unannounced on their territory, but they needed the information that Americans could provide. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics simply had more resources and more access to information than any other police force, and it knew how to use this to consolidate its authority in these questions. This distinction between multilateral policing and bilateral policing would continues to characterize European and American approaches to policing. And you can see the roots of this already in the interwar period. And as today, I think that these programs could prove complementary as well as contradictory, as the apprehension of Carlos Bacula reveals. American agents had been watching him since Bruno Schulz's May 1931 circular. Anslinger's office eventually determined that he had smuggled around 1,500 kilograms of heroin into the United States in the years 1928 to 1931 alone. And this is not looking at his activities outside of that time frame and to other countries. And this probably made him the interwar period's most prolific drug smuggler. By the late 1930s, he and his friend Louis Leon were also two of the most prominent traffickers who were still at large. So the American agents made a concerted effort to build a case against both of them. You can see here confidential wanted notices they distributed. On the top is Louis Leon, the gambler turned drug trafficker, and on the bottom is Carlos Bacula. The police secured a damning confession from a former accomplice against Louis Leon, and then they pressured the French government to bring him to trial, which led eventually to his conviction in 1939 for his participation in the heroin factory that blew up in Paris. They also tried to track Bacula's movements. In late 1937, an American narcotics agent went to Yugoslavia to get a confession from one of the men who had been involved in the shipment of opium seized in Vienna earlier that year, and then brought Austria's top narcotics officer down to Yugoslavia, to Belgrade, to take the confession as well, to build a case in Vienna against him. In the summer of 1938, both France and Germany, which had annexed Austria the previous March, requested the extradition of Bacula, of Switzerland. Bacula's defense in these extradition proceedings rested on a mixture of constant professions that he was innocent, that he had never been involved in any kind of drug trafficking, and on a fairly insightful critique of both Washington and Vienna's approach to policing narcotics. With regard to the United States, he took aim at what he saw as America's imperial ambitions globally. He claimed to be an important member of the Opera Party in Peru, which had arisen to protest the United States' imperial meddling in the country and in the region in the 1920s. He argues that the Americans had fabricated the evidence against him in order to discredit anti-American forces in Latin America and in the world. This was not true, of course. I think we've seen a good deal of evidence that he was involved in trafficking, but it was also fairly prescient. After the Second World War, Anslinger's office actually did manufacture evidence against the leader of the Opera Party in order to try to convince the world that he was involved in cocaine smuggling, because they considered him involved in some sense, in some way, with communist movements in the region. More broadly, I think Bakula's claims anticipated the way that drugs would be a vehicle for US political interventions around the globe. For all of its anti-colonial rhetoric, US drug policy already in the interwar period was strikingly imperial in its aspirations. With regards to Vienna, Bakula argued that Bruno Schulz's May 1931 circular had led all of the major police forces in Europe, and some forces outside of Europe, to register him in their files as a known drug trafficker. Then when one police force would ask another for information about him, the response would come back, he's known to us as a drug trafficker, until this designation took on an air of truth, despite the fact that it originated with one statement by one trafficker from a prison cell in Vienna. This defense, I think, highlighted the illiberalism that was at the heart of this International Criminal Police Commission's model of policing. The system worked outside of courts. It stripped foreigners, in particular, of legal means of defense. And it did so by design. It had stemmed from the Vienna police's efforts to get around Austria's weak drug laws by taking matters into their own hands, by expelling traffickers and then tracking them through their informal networks outside of any kind of court or legal oversight. By the 1930s, this kind of repressive approach to drug traffickers also pervaded Geneva. I think we can see this illustrated by the case of Wilhelm Stuber, a German national who was the first major trafficker identified by the Vienna police in 1928. At the time, they had forced him out of the country, and it seems they forced him out of the drug traffic. By 1938, he was living in Paris, separated from his family who had remained in Austria, and eking out a meager existence. That year, he wrote an appeal to the League of Nations. He told them that he was marked for expulsion from France to Germany due to a stream of notices that continued to come from the Vienna police about his involvement in the drug trafficking back in the 1920s. So he asked the League's secretariat to send a note simply stating that they had no further evidence that he had been involved since 1928 in trafficking drugs. He added, quote, "It cannot be the intention of a well-meaning administration to pursue indefinitely a man who has passed before a court of justice and who has already been made to atone." The League Secretariat did not have any further information about him. They had not heard anything about his activities since 1928, but they refused to issue any kind of statement, evidently deeming that it was more dangerous to wrongly exonerate a guilty man than to save an innocent one. It's not clear exactly what became of Stuber, but this was not a good moment for a suspected drug trafficker to be expelled to Nazi Germany. This was going to be Carlos Bakula's fate. Switzerland decided to grant Germany's extradition request for him, and they handed Bakula over to the German Reich in June 1940, as the Wehrmacht was marching on Paris. In 1941, a Vienna court sentenced him to 18 months in prison, minus time already served, for his involvement in the opium shipment. And the following year, the German authorities transferred him to a concentration camp that they administered in occupied France for his involvement in the Parisian heroin lab there. So even with the world at war, the structures that had been set up to fight the drug traffic continued to operate in some sense. Carlos Bakula was one of the world's most notorious drug traffickers at a time when both the drug control regime and the illicit drug trade were first being born. And I think his story casts light on both. Far from being the unilateral creation of the Americans, as scholars traditionally depicted it, the drug control regime was a product of an intensive multilateral cooperation with different centers in Vienna, in London, in Washington. That such a refined and far-reaching system could emerge in this short period of time, in a matter of decades, I think testifies to the transformative power of the League of Nations as a novel form of international governance in the interwar period. But I think it also shows its limits. The illicit traffic that developed reveals the failure of the League of Nations to achieve its core aim, which was stopping the black market in drugs. This, I think, is a story of unintended consequences on a global scale. Tighter controls made the illicit traffic even more entrenched, which led to even tighter drug controls. After 1945, the United Nations picked up where the League of Nations had left off, and with more or less the same results. More than a century after the world's first drug convention, the illicit drug trade remains as intractable a problem as ever, despite draconian policies around the globe. The origins of drug prohibition also pushes us, I think, to think more deeply about the geopolitical context of the League of Nations and the remaking of the global order in the first half of the 20th century. Recent scholarship has stressed the imperial logic behind the League of Nations, as I mentioned earlier. It's focused on the way that British and French thinkers saw the League as a way to reform their empire, in some way save the empire. But the drug question shows that we need to expand our conception of this interwar crisis of empire, to look at it not only in terms of overseas European empires, but also at the great European land empires that collapsed at the end of the First World War, and the way that Europeans and international officials thought of how to organize a system after this. I think international drug control system emerged from three competing initiatives with very different approaches to empire. So British officials saw internationalism as a way to reform and restore their imperial rule around the globe, and in some sense to put themselves at the center of a new international order outside of the empire. The drug policies developed by Delavigne reflected this agenda. American officials developed drug controls as part of a broader project for a new, more moral world order that rejected European empires. There was a genuine moral vision here, and I think this continues to pervade American approaches to drugs, but it was also very imperial in important regards in its aspirations for control. And I think that also pervades American drug policies today. Austrian officials had a very different attitude to empire. They saw internationalization of policing as part of a post-imperial project that was meant to build a new stable regional order in Central and Eastern Europe after the collapse of empires in that part of the world. If we think of one of the great questions facing the 20th century as not how to reform empire, as the British officials thought it was, but how to manage its passing and how to organize a world after it is gone, then I think both the Americans and the Austrians had solutions to offer for this problem. And the solutions that they did offer proved quite enduring. And this was something that Carlos Bakula experienced firsthand. He miraculously managed to survive the war. After being deposited in a French concentration camp by the Germans, he was pulled out again by German military intelligence, who wanted to recruit him into a plan they had hatched to smuggle drugs to American forces in North Africa. The Germans ended up abandoning the plan, but Bakula managed to secure false identity papers, and he lived out the remainder of the war in Paris. After the war, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the International Criminal Police Commission picked up their work where they had left off before the conflict. The American narcotics agents put Bakula on a revised international blacklist of known drug traffickers that they distributed to different police forces. And they had their agents watch him, tracking him to his new home in Chile and trying to determine whether he was involved in the cocaine trade in Latin America. They never found any evidence that he was. For its part, the International Criminal Police Commission circulated a notice asking police to track his movements. At this point, it had reformed itself in Paris under the name of Interpol, which it continues to be known as. And you could see here the wanted notice. And it was asking police to watch him and to see if he was still involved in trafficking drugs. In 1957, Carlos Bakula wrote a letter to Interpol. He asked that they stop watching his movements because he was not involved in trafficking drugs. It's not clear what became of this appeal, but I think it's a testimony to the longevity of the structures set up to police the drug trade in interwar Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great talk. And then we have time for questions. And if you do have a question, I will pass the mic to you. Is it on? Yes. Can you say your name?
My name is Scott Spector.
Hi, Scott.
And I am a historian of the Habsburg Empire, among other things. And I'm wondering if you think it would be productive to improvise some comparison with another very different and yet in many ways very similar kind of illicit trade along the same lines, namely the so-called girl trade, Mädchenhandel, which people sometimes refer to as the white slave trade or trafficking and sex trafficking. I'm sure you considered that before, but I just wondered where it takes us or where it doesn't take us in terms of what you're trying to find out about this stuff.
Sure. Should I take several or just answer one at a time? Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So in my book project, I have a chapter on drugs and I have a chapter on the human trafficking, sex trafficking issue. I think there are interesting, obvious grounds of comparison in ways that they're quite different problems. The grounds of comparison, I think one is the way that they both became tied up with anti-Semitic discourses in the respective periods. Another ground of comparison is they both were written into the Versailles Treaty and into the League of Nations Covenant. It was actually part of the same article, 23. It was like 23 was drug trade, 23C was, I think, human trafficking. And so they were treated in sort of similar ways. There was an advisory committee within the League of Nations for giving opinions about how to fight the traffic in women. And it was being sort of internationalized institutionally in a very similar mechanism to drugs that I'm showing here. I think the way that they're quite different is, I mean, one of the questions about human trafficking is, first of all, determining exactly what it is, if it was happening, and that very much depends on the definition of it. So there were a lot of debates about the definition, especially in Central Europe. Police spent a great deal of the time arguing that there was no such thing as the Mädchenhandel. After about 1905, 1906, Germans and then Austrian police are arguing that Mädchenhandel, in the juridical definition of women being moved abroad for the purposes of prostitution against their will, so through coercion, fraud, deceit, something like that. The police are arguing that actually is not happening. They're arguing these are prostitutes who know they're being moved abroad. They worked as prostitutes first in Eastern Europe. They're moving to Latin America or the United States because they can earn more there. And this becomes sort of the standard police line in Central Europe. And in that sense, I think it's very different than drug trade because no one's disputing the fact that drugs are being moved about. There's no sort of definitional debate going on there exactly. Is that?
More questions? I have one. I mean, I was wondering, since you told us a little bit about the book project more broadly by considering the sex trade, I was wondering how actually you went about to do the research and to come to this very intricate narrative, tracking down this man and building a case for what was going on institutionally. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your research process and how, what were you looking for in the archives when you started your work and how that actually shaped then looking at different cases?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't thought that seriously about that. Well, I was very lucky because I had 2 years of research funding in Europe to do kind of what I wanted, where I wanted, pursue trails as I find them, which was essential for the way this project emerged. So I began in Vienna, and I thought at that point I would go to Vienna. There's the Interpol archive at the police archive in Vienna, and the federal police in Vienna. They have sort of the files of Johann Schober. They have the Interpol files. And it ended up not being all that fruitful there, but you kind of find little trails. You find mentions of names. You find mentions of cases that would be discussed there. And then I would move to different cities, and I kind of had a list of people I was looking for and a list of types of offenses I was looking for. In every archive, you kind of find something new. So in a sense, I was just sort of following the trail of them. So with Bakula, I knew he was being mentioned in reference with Berlin, in reference with Paris, in reference to Geneva, because the League of Nations was discussing him. So I knew when I went to those archives, I would have to look up this guy. So I had him on sort of a list that I had for each archive. And then you sort of build an idea of how the police are actually working and how the different international institutions are working by looking at the paper trails that they're sending between these different capitals and between these different institutions.
So in the other chapters you're working on, so are you following the same archival process? Because you have a chapter that's on the sex trade, don't you?
Right.
And that's the Polish story. Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. So the chapter on the sex trade is, I think it's a slightly different process because I can't really follow one case like I can this one. So there I'm trying to follow much more the different groups that are problematizing sex trafficking. So you have what are called abolitionists at the time, people who are arguing for getting rid of regulated prostitution. You have social purity activists who see sex trafficking as sort of symptomatic of a broader moral failing in society, and they need to attack that. Social hygiene grows out of that. You see police administrators. And there I'm looking much more at the level of these different international institutions and groups and how they talk about this problem and how people get caught up in that, how individuals are identified as sex traffickers, and then how these policies that are emerging at the national and international level affect the lives of individuals who often are not sex traffickers, are not victims of the traffic. Often it was simply, in the cases I've found, it's simply women who are migrating, who are being targeted as victims, despite the fact that there's no evidence they're involved in any way in prostitution. And so that I'm looking much more at sort of a rhetorical and discourse, and looking at the way that the discourse shaped the way people understood certain processes in this period.
One in the back and then.
Are the Interpol archives in Vienna instead of Paris? And why would that be?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Vienna police have certain Interpol archives that were part of the Vienna police files. The actual Interpol archives are a little tricky. No one knows exactly where they ended up. So it got brought to Berlin in 1941 by the Germans, and it's originally the Wannsee conference was supposed to take place at Interpol headquarters, but then they moved it across the lake to where it did end up taking place. At the end of the Second World War, no one knows exactly what happened to them, although there is a paper trail in the American and British archives showing that the Belgians and the French took these files because they said they were refounding Interpol. So I think they ended up in Interpol, but Interpol won't say anything, and they're not obligated to. They're only obligated to give information, I think, if you're the individual that they're tracking. They're very sort of opaque secrecy laws there, because it's not really an international institution, which is one of the things I was kind of hinting at here. It's this very strange organization that was founded sort of informally by police. It never really had a convention founding it. And it's had a few sort of agreements to regulate what they do with their files, but it's still pretty shady.
Thank you so much for this talk. I'm Jess Robin-Sushkovsky. I'm a medical anthropologist. And so I'm interested in the kind of intersections between the licit and illicit aspects of the drugs/pharmaceuticals and the development of the drug control apparatus and the public health apparatus at the same time. So I'm just wondering if you can say more about what points the health regulatory regimes intersect with drugs, or moments where they come apart, or speak to what you found about that topic.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, so one of the big stories I'm trying to tell in this chapter that I did not come through quite as much in the talk, because I wanted to focus on the sort of bigger geopolitical questions, is the way that you see a shift in international institutions dealing with drugs from what we can think of as economic regulation and public health in the 1920s to a much more criminal and punitive approach to drugs in the 1930s. And there's, I think, different reasons for this. I think one of it is sort of a shifting weight of actors in Geneva, where you have NGOs that are much more involved in Geneva in the 1920s as funding dries up, and with the authoritarian turn in the 1930s, governments and administrators in Geneva are much less interested in working with these sort of public health NGO groups. I think another reason for this is just because one of the things I was trying to point at is, as these groups create a problem in the 1920s that needs to be solved, these, what we can think of as early NGOs, sort of create a problem, bring it to Geneva. Geneva adopts some of the solutions they proposed to drugs. It was more economic regulation. There were some public health measures, but these do not actually end up stopping the problem. So then police can come in with sort of a cheaper solution of just criminalizing everything, and sort of a much more direct problem, sort of vaguer social policy approaches. And so that replaces the international approach to these problems, I think, in the 1930s until maybe a decade or two ago. I think at this point we're seeing public health really come forward again and how people are talking about how to deal with drugs. But it took several decades for that to sort of, for people to really start questioning this punitive model that was pushed through the League of Nations and the United Nations for probably over half a century.
Hi, so I'm Erin. I'm an undergraduate, and I'm actually studying movements around marijuana legalization in the United States. So my question is, and I'm not sure if your research touched on this, but was there any resistance, anyone questioning the logic coming out of these conventions around the regulation of pharmaceutical companies producing opium, and then later around the way that governments were seeking to regulate, through their police forces, the trade?
There's surprisingly little, I would say. I mean, one of the things that very much shocked me was how few people actually sort of questioned the logic that these were dangerous and needed to be controlled. I think one of the reasons for this was alcohol. I mean, I think people were looking at alcoholism as a major public problem. I think if you look at 19th century Europe, alcoholism was a major public problem. The levels of addiction, the levels of violence associated with it was hugely problematic. And most Europeans did not think you could prohibit alcohol. I mean, Americans obviously tried it and it didn't go well. But they thought if we can stop the next alcohol before it gets here, that would probably be good for everybody. And so I think that was one of the reasons they were thinking this was a viable approach. This was also an age where people just believed that these state apparatuses could solve social problems like this through these kind of policies. And I mean, with drugs, they end up not obviously, but I mean, one of the things that I did not get at in this talk as much is if you actually look at the rates of drug use, it's fairly low in most of Europe, right? So they're thinking if we can stop drug abuse before it gets to Europe, it will never sort of take root here. They're looking at a place like China at the time, which is a mess in the interwar period. It's descending into chaos. It has no ability to govern it. And people are discussing that as a result of opium trade, as a way to attack imperialism of the European powers. I think they exaggerate the level to which opium played into instability in China, but there was something to it. It was fueling the warlord groups in China in the 1920s and 1930s. And so I think a lot of people just thought we can stop it, and it would be good to stop it, and very few people questioned it, other than pharmaceuticals, obviously.
Thank you. So I have a question. In recent years, there have been many debates within history, mostly, about doing this transnational history rather than international history. And some historians and other scholars question it, saying it's just a new fancy name, and actually the methodology is the same. And I was wondering how your research fits into this debate.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So I think it's a little complicated because no one has the same definition of all these terms. The way I think of it is, and I think sort of the common way of conceiving this is transnational history would be looking at transnational networks, flows of ideas, flows of goods, things like this. So me looking at a guy like Carlos Bacola, that's transnational history. Looking at the drug trade, that's sort of transnational history. International history, you're taking seriously the nation state and these international institutions that are organizing the cooperation between these nation states. And so you're trying to look at the way that norms, institutions, sort of ideas about the international system at maybe more of an economic or political level develop. And so I would say when I engage with this drug prohibition regime as a system, that's international history. When I'm doing this bottom-up approach to criminals who are moving across borders, that's much more transnational history.
Catherine Berger, he actually has a very interesting distinction. She uses the term, like for international, she would say it's transstatal, because that's really states that are involved. And then transnational or trans-ethno-national, that's across nations as bodies of, you know, of populations. And I think that might be helpful because, you know, international studies or international history also has this kind of, it smacks of a different kind of era of historiographic work. And And what you're doing is then transstatal. It may be that you're doing both transstatal and transnational. So that might be a way where you can kind of firmly establish your contribution without sounding like you're doing more traditional international relations type scholarship, which I don't know, maybe in history people still like that, but
Well, I think the move in history now is to distinguish between diplomatic and international history.
okay.
And the international history does much more of the sort of NGOs, international organizations. League of Nations is very big now with international history. And they think of that as different than diplomatic history, which is much more sort of foreign offices of different countries talking.
In any case, I mean, that's fabulous work, and thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Me too.